Hello and welcome to In Focus. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by political scientist Charles Murray. Charles is the W.H. Brady Scholar at the America Enterprise Institute and author of some of the most influential works of social science in the past 40 years. And most recently, he authored the new book, Taking Religion Seriously. Charles, thank you for joining the podcast today.
My pleasure.
So, this book is a great and memorable read. I've really enjoyed it, not only because of what it says, but because of who you are. A highly credible, eminent thinker. And there you are, sort of showing your work about what you think about some of the greatest questions. And you do this from this purely, rational perspective. And you decide to go about it this way. You say earlier in the book, and you decide to do it this way because you suffer from a perceptual deficit in spirituality. I wonder if you could start by telling us a bit about that.
Sure. A lot of people who are like I was, I'd label us being overeducated agnostics. A lot of us sort of think that people who profess to have profound spiritual experiences are either making it up or they're deluding themselves. And we just sort of pass it off that way because we don't see any of that. Well, here's my proposition for them. Spiritual perception is akin to any other human trait, which is it goes from low to high in different people in different ways. And the analogy I use was with music. A violist friend of ours could listen to music and hear a completely different thing than what I hear. It is emotionally and intellectually, aesthetically available to him in a way it is not to me. I listen to it and I kind of enjoy it. So I'm not tone deaf, but I am way lower on the scale of musical receptivity than he is. And similarly, I have a wife who is much higher on the scale of spiritual perception than I am. And I do not have the option of saying that she is deluded or kidding herself or lying because uh, you don't know my wife. I think she has an extraordinary intellect. I mean, we're talking Oxford, Yale, the whole shebang, and she does very realistic. And I watched her over a period of years making progress in insights that I couldn't follow. And so eventually I got dragged into it to try to use my skill set as best I could.
And it seems to me a great place to develop and practice that skill set is a Quaker Friends meeting. I've been to a few of these, maybe about 10 years ago. I'm Catholic, but for a little bit I decided I need to go to these Friends meetings and see what it's all about. And it's such an interesting experience because you're sitting in silence, first of all, with a bunch of strangers, or at least it was to me. I didn't know anyone else in there. And occasionally somebody stands up and is moved. I guess they're, very spiritually perceptive. And at the end of the meeting, somebody rings a bell and says good morning. And there you are sitting next to all of these people for an hour. And you really feel as if you've gotten to know them. Do you think that your attendance at these friends' meetings over the years, did that deepen your spiritual perception?
I would like to say yes, because that's the appropriate answer. It had a big effect on me, but gradual and with a sense of, well, let me back off for a second. I have a hard time sitting in Quaker meeting and meditating in any meaningful sense of the word, because that's what you're supposed to be doing. It's a form of communal meditation. And when the meeting is a really good meeting, it's called a gathered meeting. And there's this sense that you just referred to of this unspoken communion that's going on. I have a very hard time entering into that. But it is marginally acceptable to read during Quaker meeting, at least part of the time, as long as it's the Bible or some other religious text. And so I would read the Bible for about 20 minutes out of the 45 minutes, hour of each meeting, sometimes more than that. I'd read more than that. Well, you do that for several years and you've read a lot of the Bible. and and
Mhm.
uh, I read parts of it repeatedly. That had a long-term effect on me.
Mm.
Uh, but what really moved me off dead center was a few things that had nothing directly to do with religion. One of those came from Charles Krauthammer, who was a friend of mine And we had a chess club, which we called the Pariah Chess Club after the bell curve came out, since
Hmm.
pariah seemed to describe at least a couple of members of the chess club. And one time he made the observation, which was not original with him, but I'd never heard before. Why is there something rather than nothing? And that hit me. It and I realized if you couldn't just pass it off, you had to say, well, things need to be created. And then after another period of years, I ran across the physics of the Big Bang,
Hmm.
which is as close as I've had to a road to Damascus moment. It's I read a little book by Martin Rees called Just Six Numbers. He's not religious himself. He's an astrophysicist. He was Britain's astronomer royal. But the six numbers refer to parameters of the Big Bang that had to be just right, or else we would have had a universe of radiation, or we would have had a universe of nothing but black holes. We wouldn't have had a universe with stars. And if you don't have stars, you don't have planets, you don't have the periodic table filled out. And the degree of precision with which these parameters, which are not motivated by theory, had to be, well, the odds against it are one in trillions. And that number was calculated by a Nobel laureate, whose name I'm now blocking on, in physics. Well, I read that book. I got to the end of the book, and I didn't have any acceptable options except to think that there was some intentionality behind the universe. I don't believe in a one in a million chance, and I don't believe in multiverses. And so that was a major effect on me.
Let's go back to dead center. I think that's a really interesting concept that you describe yourself being as dead center at sort of the beginning of this journey that you bring us through in the book. And from what I understand, dead center means you sort of believed the mainstream narratives of the past 500 years. Science has disproved God, and humans are basically just very smart animals. Um, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more, the Big Bang and the fine tuning of the universe. What else along that journey from dead center uh, turned your head and changed your mind on all these things?
Well, the next things had to do with consciousness, because I wouldn't say 500 years. I blame it on the Enlightenment. So it's more like the beginning of the 18th century, 19th century, 20th. But during that period, materialism, in the sense that consciousness exists exclusively in the brain, has become very close to a dogma in accepted science. If you question whether whether consciousness exists exclusively in the brain, you will get lots of people who will simply dismiss you, and it doesn't make any difference what the evidence is that you're offering. Well, I got a couple of different kinds of evidence that seemed to me to meet pretty rigorous standards for extraordinary evidence. One is the body of material on near-death experiences,
Mm.
which I suspect most of the people listening to this have heard of. Well, that body of evidence does not consist of a bunch of anecdotes. It has been very systematically approached internationally by lots of different people, systematic databases, prospective databases, very elaborate protocols for assembling the data. And I just don't think you can discard it. Discard instances in which there is no plausible explanation for what seems to be consciousness while the person had no access to the five senses because the heart was stopped, respiration had stopped, brain waves had stopped. There's another body of evidence fewer people know about. In many ways, lends itself to even more rigorous proof. That's called terminal lucidity. And if you know anybody who works at a hospice and you ask them about it, they are very likely to have experienced this. That you have people with advanced dementia don't recognize their spouse, don't recognize their kids, have not said a word for years, and hours before they die, maybe 2 days, one day before they die, there is a period of 15 minutes, an hour, maybe a little bit more, in which they're back. And by back, I don't mean they say a discernible word. I mean their personalities are there, memories are there, recognition is there, and then relapse, and then they die. Well, what's that all about? Because physiologically, it can be demonstrated that the brain at that point is not capable of organized thought. Too many of these networks have been too violently disrupted, and there are no replacement networks. That kind of thing makes me say simple materialism is facing some real challenges that need to be taken seriously.
I suppose a skeptic might say to that, a materialist might say to that, well, we just don't yet understand the physical inner workings well enough, and we don't understand the brain. I have my friends who, aren't religious, don't believe in God. They have a very hard time wrapping their heads around the idea that the brain might be a receptor for consciousness instead of the engine of
Originator, the
consciousness.
engine, yeah, good, well put.
Yeah. So what might you say to someone who, okay, they might acknowledge that there's some interesting studies on near-death experience, terminal lucidity, things like that, but just can't get to that place where consciousness doesn't emanate from the brain.
Well, if I were going to be flippant with them, I would say, wow, is that an act of faith? Because we know a lot about the functioning of the brain. We know a great deal. And we know what happens with dementia. And if you get someone where you just point out, look, we know the networks, the prefrontal cortex, we know all sorts of things that in dementia have been seriously damaged to the point that they just simply don't function. If you're going to say, oh, there is some unknown network that can redevelop or something, that's faith. Okay, that's
Okay.
faith because everything we know concretely says, that's not in the cards. So I guess I'd make that into a broader statement. There's a problem called scientism. That's a phrase that William James liked to use. Scientism, which takes on dogmas of its own. And one of the dogmas now is consciousness is only in the brain. And if you are a serious scholar who is challenging that, and there are serious scholars who are challenging that, they are being treated the same way that those who challenged the evidence for the Big Bang were treated for decades, as if they were religious, they were faking a religious gloss on Genesis and trying to impose it on physics, that they were basically hooted at and laughed at. And
Right.
that happens a lot in science. Well, Thomas Kuhn's book on paradigm shifts gives chapter and verse for a lot of historical examples of it.
I think it's a really interesting point about the Big Bang and how it was received and how that was shouted down. And I wasn't familiar with that story. I didn't realize that Lemaitre, who is a Catholic priest who discovered the Big Bang, I didn't realize that he ran up against that kind of derision.
Mhm.
And to me, that's very revealing. Perhaps you want to tell us a bit about that story?
Yeah, he was an ordained priest, but he was also a physicist. And he took the observations about the expanding universe that had been made in the early 20s, and he extrapolated from that back. And if it's expanding and you go the other direction, you get down to a beginning point. And and he published that actually. They talk about the Hubble equations, but Lemaitre came up with the same equations independently, and I think he did it first, so they should be called the Hubble-Lemaitre equations, which simply pointed in a very concrete scientific way, no religion involved. If we are observing this expansion of the universe, there had to be a beginning. And I don't think that Einstein joined in the derision, but Einstein was so disturbed by some of the implications of his mathematics in the theory of relativity that the universe was not eternal, that he introduced a fudge factor into the equations that would foreclose expansion or contraction of the universe, which he later called the worst error of his career. Well, that was a case of somebody saying, this can't be true, so I will fudge the data, to, or in this case, the
Mhm.
equations, to make it so it isn't true. Fascinating stuff.
Uh, you also discovered C.S. Lewis at a very important point in your journey. Tell us a bit about that.
Uh, well, you see, to me, maybe you had the same experience and you went to college. When I went to college a long time ago, early 1960s, I immediately learned that smart people don't believe that stuff anymore,
Mhm.
referring to religion.
It was like
I,
that in the 90s still, too.
yeah, yeah, and nobody propagandized that. That's just what everybody knew. And look, you're an 18-year-old college freshman. You want to fit in, and and I wanted to fit in, and I wanted to be one of the smart people. And if the people don't believe that stuff anymore, I guess I don't believe it either. And my wife had the same experience. Well, with C.S. Lewis, you read the first 10 pages of Mere Christianity or anything else he wrote, and you can't say to yourself that smart people don't believe that stuff anymore because C.S. Lewis just radiates intelligence in his prose, a calm, measured, wise intelligence that so I found myself reading Mere Christianity, wanting to argue with him. And again, he would anticipate my arguments and come up with a counter argument. And I say, well, that's pretty good too. But it was also C.S. Lewis who made me realize that if I wanted to take religion seriously, and that's what we're talking about here, that's the reason for the title of the book. I'm not trying to proselytize and make people into believing Christians. I'm asking them to take this stuff seriously. Well, Lewis has this famous trilemma that you do not have the option of saying that Jesus is a great moral teacher, but he wasn't the Son of God. Lewis says, listen, if somebody says some of the things Jesus said, he he can he has to either be a liar or he has to be a lunatic, because only a lunatic would claim this, or he has to be the Son of God. Well, I didn't have to buy that because I said I've been looking into the revisionist stuff, and it turns out the Gospels weren't really written in any meaningful sense. They were put together over decades in different parts of the Roman Empire by different traditions, and you can't really know what Jesus actually said about himself, nor can you actually know what Jesus really said. So if I'm going to use that as an out, I better read into that. And not only read the revisionists, but I better read the defenders of the tradition. And so C.S. Lewis was instrumental in forcing me into that line of reading. And I just consistently found the defenses of the traditional Orthodox Christian position to be calmer, saner, and more grounded in fact than in my reading the revisionists.
Yeah, the revisionists, they bring another L into the equation, legend. And I also got into my 20s positive that the historicity of the Gospels was indefensible, that it was the result of hundreds of years of the telephone game,
Yep.
and that it would be impossible to know with any certainty what Jesus actually said, what actually happened in his time. But that's not really the case, is it?
No. Well, there are all sorts of things. Something, Peter, that I hope listeners realize. I'm not describing a several years of study and reading than which I was in a constant uh, religious spiritual mode. I'm talking about fascinating stuff. And let me just give an example of the historicity problem. It is still the mainstream biblical scholarship that the Gospels were written after 70 CE. And at least 70, and then John written later than that. And John didn't really write John, and Matthew didn't really write Matthew, etc. And as I was reading the revisionists, I would read about, well, there is an early tradition that Mark was taking down the testimony of Peter in the Gospel of Mark. And I was got curious about, well, where did that religion or that tradition come from? It turns out writings that have survived by a few very early church fathers. And you read those writings, and they do not read like the meanderings of delusional people. They read as the accurate reporting of what went on in the creation of the Gospels by people who either had talked to the first generation directly or who had access to all sorts of testimonies and written materials we no longer have access to because they disappeared. And in short, I'm saying, A, that seems more plausible to me, these traditions, that the Gospel of Mark really is a guy taking down Peter's words,
Right.
that John really is the disciple who, in his later years, was asked by others to fill in the period that was not covered by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Uh, and then when you get to the dating of the Gospels, I think the evidence that Acts was written before 64 or 65 is really powerful. And that if Acts was written that late, then the timing for all the others is pushed back. And we don't have time to go into the reasons I say there's a lot of evidence for. Uh, Buy the book and you can read it there. But there's a lot of it, and it's persuasive.
And I notice in all of your chapters, you have a little box that says, where again, you're showing your work. Here are the sources. Here are the books that I went to that helped inform my thinking on this. And on the historicity of the Gospels, one of the ones you mention is Brant Petree's The Case for Jesus. And I'd like to recommend that to our audience for an even deeper read into the dating of the Gospels in particular and the earliest Gospels.
Mm.
Um, and that there's really compelling evidence that those gospels they came before the year 70,
Yeah.
which changes the equation on how we think of this in a number of ways because the sources would have been in contact with the original apostles. um, and yeah, it's just it's remarkable. So that brings us to some of the more bold claims about Christianity. A couple weeks ago, I had on Lawrence Krauss, the theoretical physicist and atheist, one of the original four horsemen of the new atheists. And every time I try to come up with ways to convince someone that Jesus really rose from the dead, or the Shroud of Turin is really the
Mm.
burial cloth of Jesus. I have Lawrence Krauss's voice in the back of my mind, um, making fun of me. Um, but I'm really interested in finding ways to convince people who are very strong materialists that this isn't just kabuki. Um, of all of these things you mention in your book, these bolder claims of Christianity, what might be what you find to be the most compelling bit of evidence or line of argumentation that this really happened?
We're talking about the resurrection now. Let's do that because that's the most challenging one. I think you can discount the loaves and fishes and the walking on the water, and it does not do any great harm to the theology. But the resurrection is right there at the center of all of it. Well, I think first place, it's okay to think in terms of probabilities. I know it's not okay in some cosmic sense. It would be nice to have certain faith. But in fact, I want the people who reject everything not to laugh it out of court, but sort of confront the sequential questions that need to be answered. And in the case of the resurrection, there is one thing I think we can be absolutely confident of. Something extraordinary happened on Easter. Why do I say that? Just think of the context. You have this leader of a small group, charismatic guy, who is not just killed, he is killed in a gruesome and also shameful, humiliating way. You are being threatened with persecution yourself if you're one of the disciples. Remember Peter denying Jesus 3 times. So even if you don't take all the details in the gospel as absolutely accurate, you have to start out with this basic fact. You had a set of men and women who, after the crucifixion, should have been shattered. They, we're not talking about sophisticated people here. We're talking about, in the case of the disciples, manual workers uh, who had been following this man for 3 years. They are not going to get up the next morning and say, gee, let's steal his body and hide it away and then claim he's risen from the dead. That doesn't seem very likely. And it also doesn't seem likely that 55 days after the crucifixion, that they are confidently preaching this, the risen Christ gospel. Something happened. Now, I go with a respected British theologian, John Polkinghorne, on this. He was also a theoretical physicist at Cambridge and then became ordained in the Anglican Church. And he says that the evidence is such that in some way, and he's willing to fudge on, are we talking about a physical resurrection? Are we talking about something more ephemeral than that?
A
But in some,
metaphorical resurrection,
yeah,
yeah.
metaphorical resurrection, except a powerful one, which he says that in some sense, the Christ of 2,000 years ago is still alive in the Christian church. And he had language for it that is much more eloquent than I just used. But it starts from the something profound happened. Okay, so then you look at the alternative explanations of they hid the body, that I won't go through them here. We don't have time for that. They're not very plausible either. And then you get the Shroud of Turin. And Lawrence Krauss cannot laugh at you unless Lawrence Krauss has proved that he has read the technical report of the Shroud of Turin Research Project, which is published in Acta Chemica, not a religious tract, and which is full of hardcore science, which concludes things that do not allow you to laugh it out of court, which proves in as with as solid evidence as hardcore science has that the image on the Shroud of Turin, which when seen in a photographic negative is extraordinarily detailed, that the image was not created by any known paint or pigment. It was not created with directional strokes of any kind. The conclusion is it's not just that we cannot prove how the image was created, we cannot come up with a hypothesis that fits all the known facts of the Shroud of Turin. And there's lots more stuff about pollen that was found on it and the rest, which is collateral evidence. The hardcore evidence is such that you are driven with very few options. The main problem is a dating problem with the carbon dating that said, oh, it's a medieval forgery. But on the other hand, you also have the lead author of the Shroud of Turin Research Project, who has, again, a technical article demonstrating that the patch that they used for the carbon dating was not part of the original shroud. And you have another way of dating which puts the shroud at 2,000 years. So I leave that as you don't laugh that away. If you want to argue about it, you have to argue.
Yeah, if the shroud were a medieval forgery, that would be more impressive than someone rising from the dead.
Yeah, basically, it's more magical in a way.
Right. Well, Charles, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And I'd like to encourage everybody in the audience, please go get your book and take religion seriously. And at least, as you say, at least wrestle with it. And see, go to the end of your reasoning and see if there's something here that might be worth reconsidering. But thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for writing this book. And please come say hi again soon.
I'd love to. Thanks very much.